Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Peries coming to you from Baltimore. Over the last 10 years, there has been a growing resistance in the U.S. to Israel's violation of human rights, growing settlements and walls, and denial of land, livelihood, and economic development of Palestinians. Add to all of this the military operation launched by Israel between July 8th and August 26th of 2014. Palestinians now refer to this as 50 days of death and destruction by Israel. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, at least 2,131 Palestinians were killed in Gaza as a result of Israel's Operation Protective Edge. At least 1,473 of the dead were civilians, including 501 children and 257 women. The resistance to all of this in the U.S. is a growing movement nationwide, particularly on college campuses, where many young Arab students are coming of age and acquiring consciousness about the politics of the region. This movement has taken on a life on college campuses, criticizing the Israeli government's continued assault on the people of Palestine, constituted by Arabs and a growing number of Jewish Americans. Campus groups have called on their universities to divest from companies that do business with Israeli corporations. The result, according to two reports released this week, is harassment, charges of anti-Semitism, intimidation, and even job loss and prevention of advancement for those who publicly speak out. One report, titled "The Palestine Exception to Free Speech, a Movement Under Attack in the U.S.," details 152 incidents of censorship, punishment, and sanctions in 2014 alone against pro-Palestine groups, and 150 incidents and 33 requests for assistance in anticipation of potential suspension. The second report, released by the advocacy group Jewish Voices for Peace, is titled "Stifling Dissent: How Israel's Defenders Use False Charges of Anti-Semitism to Limit Debate Over Israel on Campuses." To discuss all of this, I'm joined by two guests, Dima Khalidi and Judith Butler. Joining us from Chicago is Dima Khalidi. She is the founder and director of Palestine Solidarity Legal Support and Cooperating Counsel with the Center for Constitutional Rights. And joining us from Berkeley, California is Judith Butler. She is the Maxine Elliott Professor of Comparative Literature and Critical Theory at UC Berkeley, and the author of several books on gender, sexuality, politics, and ethics. She is also on the advisory board for academic freedom with Jewish Voices for Peace. I thank you both for joining me today. So Dima, let me begin with you. Was there any one incident that propelled you into doing this report? And if so, what was it?
Well, there have been many incidents, actually. Palestine Legal was founded in 2012 as a result of a number of high-profile incidents that we saw, including the prosecution and conviction of 10 students at the University of California, Irvine, for protesting a speech by the Israeli ambassador, a kind of unprecedented criminal prosecution for expressing views at a public lecture. So before the establishment of Palestine Legal, we were seeing a rise in these kinds of incidents of suppression of Palestine advocacy, especially on campuses. And since we were established, we we have responded to nearly 300. This is just in the last 18 months, in fact, between January 2014 and June 2015. We responded to nearly 300 incidents of suppression on about 65 college campuses in 24 different states. So it really is a widespread problem. It's not just a few isolated incidents we're seeing. I think several incidents in the last couple of years stand out, and they really illustrate the range of tactics that are being used against Palestine solidarity activists in order to silence them. And one that stands out, I think, is the case of Northeastern students who, were distributing flyers in the dorms. And, as a result, they were visited by the campus police and called by the police and interrogated. Their group was suspended. Several students were disciplined. So we're seeing these kinds of disproportionate punishments of students and others, and censorship of people who are expressing views on Palestine, because there's a lot of backlash from groups in this country that do not want that view to be aired. So they're engaging in a number of tactics to make sure that doesn't happen. And part of that is by pressuring universities and other institutions to cancel events or to punish student activities and to fire professors, as happened with Steven Salaita only last fall. He lost his career has been ruined because of complaints about his tweets on the Israeli assaults on Gaza. So the effects are real for people here.
Judith, the Stifling Dissent, the report done by Jewish Voices for Peace, what are the types of incidences or suppression here that are categorically that led you to issue such a report?
Yes, well, first, let me just say that I think Jewish Voice for Peace is enormously pleased to be publishing its report at the same time that Palestine Legal publishes its report. And I think these two reports should be read together, and they should be understood as an indication of a growing indignation on the part of many people concerned with campus politics and academic freedom, with these tactics of intimidation. In my view, and the view of the report, really, there are kind of four general areas of concern. One is intimidation, the intimidation of students, undergraduates, graduates, intimidation of faculty, especially contingent faculty and non-tenured faculty, censorship, interventions into the curricula we teach, the books we teach, and sometimes also not allowing faculty or activists to speak on campus when their views don't coincide with mainstream Zionist understandings of the state of Israel and Palestine. I think there's also, in addition to intimidation and censorship, there's another way to limit debate, which is simply to say, as Hillel does, any speaker who doesn't actually defend the same view of Zionism that they hold to is not welcome at Hillel. So those students, mainly Jewish students who come to Hillel to understand their world and to understand Jewish values, are not allowed to actually hear a variety of viewpoints about Zionism at Hillel itself. Why wouldn't Hillel be a place that invites an open and robust debate? So what we've seen is the production of Open Hillel, a group of students who had to break off from Hillel because it limited debates so severely. And lastly, of course, we're also seeing forms of retaliation. Some of them are implicit. young faculty members or graduate students who take certain kinds of critical positions on the State of Israel are being threatened with loss of job. We did see that in the Stephen Salaita case. They're being threatened with professional devastation and limitation. And also some state assemblies are now under pressure trying to pass laws that retaliate against individuals or institutions that have supported the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. All of these are issues of great concern.
And Judith, how broad is the fight against the Palestinian free speech? Because we now see that it's not just limited to campuses, it's also taken off a new life in terms of the divestment campaign in state governments.
I'm not sure how many people it represents, but I think that it's very forceful. The State of Israel has put a fair amount of money into its current campaign to fight what it calls the delegitimation of the State of Israel. It seems to me that open debate on Israeli policy or even open debate on Zionism is not the same as delegitimation. I mean, if the state understands itself as legitimate, it can enter that debate and say, we're legitimate. And certainly legitimacy is not the only question that's being raised by many of the people who are targeted with censorship and intimidation. But there are groups like the Amcha Initiative. We don't know how large they are. They don't really publish their membership, if they have a membership, but their tactics are forceful, blacklisting, making a list of students, faculty who have supported boycott, divestment, and sanctions or have refused to oppose it. What's the point of a blacklist? The point of a blacklist is to tell future employers that these people are a problem. Or a group like Stand With Us, which understands itself as doing advocacy work for the state of Israel. It takes an active stance against J Street, which is actually, for the most part, a Zionist organization, which has some criticisms of the State of Israel. It actually calls itself pro-Israel, a language I don't really understand. It sounds like football. But in any case, members of Stand With Us violently assaulted Jewish Voice for Peace members in Berkeley at a divestment hearing in 2010. And then there are other groups as well that that tend to characterize Muslim student associations as terrorist. So this kind of really appalling language and irresponsible speech and retaliatory methods and intimidation techniques are becoming quite common. I don't know. They're strong in the sense that they cause a scandal and they do frighten administrators, but I'm not sure how many people actually are behind these efforts. I think it's a good question.
Now, how much of this campaign against Palestinian free speech is rooted back to the State of Israel?
Well, we don't know exactly, but as you said, there have been reports that the government of Israel is putting money, resources towards this. The Prime Minister himself has said that that the state will work to engage in lawfare against those who are advocating for Palestinian rights, especially through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we also know that there are connections between certain Israel advocacy groups that are engaging in these tactics and the State of Israel. So an organization like Shurat Hadin, the Israel Law Center, which is behind a lot of litigation and lawsuit threats here and around the world. We saw they have threatened the American Studies Association with a lawsuit, as well as others. we know that there are connections between them and the Israeli state as well, that they may even be taking direction from the state of Israel. So the connections are there. There's also evidence that Stand With Us has close connections with the state of Israel. So they're undeniable. The depth of them, I think, is not fully known.
I think we are moving into a kind of McCarthyism, where we have already moved. It seems to me that many of the people who defended the firing of Stephen Salaita did so precisely on ideological grounds. They didn't like his point of view, and they also presumed they knew what his point of view was. And that was a non-hiring, or a firing, really, that was based on a kind of panicked understanding of his views. But the truth is that people have been arguing about boycotts for a very long time. Divestment, sanctions, these are established methods, and they belong to a nonviolent movement that's seeking broad freedoms and justice for the people of Palestine. One can be for it, one can be against it, but it's properly part of debate in any democratic society. And to try to shut it down and to scare people into thinking that their lives will be ruined and their professional prospects ruined is really, I think, not only an abrogation of basic principles of freedom of expression and freedom of association, but it's an active practice of censorship that should be opposed on both legal and political grounds.
And Dima, of the 152 incidences of censorship, punishment, sanctions that you have documented, and this has been over the period of 2014 against pro-Palestinian groups, how many of them are as severe as Salaita's case?
Salaita's case is one of the more severe that we've seen in terms of repercussions for faculty, certainly. But we see on a daily basis the same kind of effect that Salaita's case has had, where faculty are intimidated or silenced because of their views. We have seen a couple of other cases of faculty being terminated, certainly being attacked for their courses or programs that they put on. The Middle East Studies Association, the Middle East Studies programs have been attacked. There's been an attack on the federal funding for Middle East Studies programs, claiming that they are not balanced and that they violate certain laws, which is not the case, certainly. So we're seeing a broad-based attacks. The kinds of cases we deal with are also, it's a progressive situation. So we see a lot of pressure being put on universities after a student group does an action, for example. We see a complaint. We saw several complaints to the Department of Education about Palestine activism on campuses. And while these complaints were dismissed ultimately, there were investigations that were open for years, and it resulted in another tactic that we're seeing, which are a number of bureaucratic barriers being placed to prevent students from organizing, security fees being imposed on them before they have an event, being called into the administration to discuss what they are going to say, to give lists of their membership, to give them scripts of their mock checkpoints on campuses. So the effects are more than just people losing their jobs. It's a matter of student activists and others who are made to feel like what they're doing is wrong, criminal somehow, and then we see a lot of law enforcement scrutiny as well. being put on them. So, these accusations of anti-Semitism, of terrorism, are really troubling. There's really a range of tactics that are being used here, and their effects also range. But there's it's really disturbing how much of this we're seeing, and even if it's not a firing, it has a real effect on people.
Judith, how does Jewish Voices for Peace actually advise people how to deal with this false accusation of anti-Semitism?
Well, I think that the main point that Jewish Voice for Peace has communicated on this issue is that to criticize the state of Israel for its policy on Palestine, which would include its occupation, which would include the siege of Gaza, which would include the dispossession of Palestinians in 48, and then again in the last many decades, every time new borders were drawn. To offer those kinds of criticisms is certainly not anti-Semitic. One is not attacking the Jewish people. One's not making any claims about who the Jewish people are. One is criticizing a state for unjust policies, and one is criticizing a state for an ongoing subjugation of a minority population that is and is not within its national boundaries. So I think we need to disarticulate those two. I think there's a great fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. Many Jewish people also mute their own criticisms of Israel because they're afraid of being accused of self-hatred, or they're being accused of collaboration with anti-Semitism. But many Jews are not in agreement with the state of Israel. The Pew Center published a very interesting poll that suggested that the majority of Jews in the United States don't have strong feelings about Israel. So, and then the rest of us are obviously arguing with one another. I don't know any Jewish dinner table where that argument isn't happening. So, we're a diverse and complex people with many political points of view. I don't think you can say that the state of Israel adequately or fully represents the views of the Jewish people. It's simply not true.
And Dima, the last word to you. One of the things cited in the report is the ways in which legislation is being used in order to stifle free speech. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we've seen, certainly since the American Studies Association passed a resolution to endorse the academic boycott of Israeli academic institutions in December 2013, we saw a wave of legislation that directly attacked BDS and the academic boycott in particular. So in 2014, we saw about 11 such pieces of legislation being introduced. And, with a lot of opposition to this legislation, the bills that were introduced did not pass. And a lot of these bills actually try to defund universities that subsidize associations like the ASA and that endorse the boycott. So, such a clearly unconstitutional bill did not pass muster in several states where it was introduced. We've also seen a number of non-binding resolutions that have been introduced that condemn the academic boycott, that say it's anti-Semitic, that profess their undying loyalty to the state of Israel, and so many of those have passed, often unanimously in state legislatures, and we've seen more of that this year. And there is a promise of more to come. In Illinois, a bill passed that actually forces the state pension system to divest from companies that boycott Israel. So we're expecting more legislation like this that basically, imposes the state's view of this issue on people, and it's troubling. It has a serious chilling effect, and it raises serious constitutional questions as well. So we've seen there's a bill pending in Pennsylvania as well that tries to defund universities. So this is a broad-based attack. We saw Sheldon Adelson himself pledge millions of dollars to combat BDS and Palestine activism in general, and he has said that much of that will go towards lawfare, towards lawsuits, legislation directly attacking the BDS movement. So we're expecting more of this, and it's a really troubling trend. But we do know that in this country, the right to boycott is protected by the First Amendment. It's very clear, given the history of social justice boycotts in this country, from the civil rights era. This is a constitutionally protected speech activity and associational activity. So there's only so much impact that this legislation can have without violating First Amendment rights, and so it's very clear that people should understand that this doesn't affect their right to advocate for BDS, and the impact is really more of the chilling effect that these things have, and the pronouncements of state policy here.
Dima, Khalidi, and Judith Butler, I thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.